What's up guys, TechLab here. Now in today's video we're going to be taking a look at another finewine graphics card here from AMD. This is the AMD Radeon R9 380X. It probably is one of the most impressive graphics cards that I've had in the studio for a while, if I'm totally honest, but today we want to see if we can still game on it. Now, in between Radeon's HD series and their RX series, they produced a number of cards with some even weirder names, from the R5 all the way up to the R9. I don't 100% understand all of the naming conventions for these cards, to be honest. I completely missed all of the generations of these cards, but I managed to pick up one of these and it wasn't actually that expensive. I paid just under £50 for this card, which when it comes to performance, it's absolutely lacking. Nobody should actually do that, but mine actually came in pretty decent quality with the box, and as you guys know, I like to collect things, so I thought this would make a great piece for the studio. I didn't really have that much expectations for this card because of its age. I didn't think it was going to play that many games, but it actually really surprised me. The R9 380X was released in 2015 by AMD as a reasonably high-end graphics card, probably not in comparison to its NVIDIA counterparts, but when it comes to the AMD stack, it was actually pretty decent. The model that we've got here today is obviously from Sapphire. It is the Sapphire Nitro model, and it might be the reason why this card is actually quite impressive. It looks absolutely stunning. I think that they should probably make these kind of designs again in the future. Doesn't matter which angle you actually turn this card to. The back plate is really nice and it is aluminium. It's not plastic like you get on many modern graphics cards, so it actually does actively work as a heatsink itself. That's really nice and impressive. The actual shroud for the cooler itself is really solidly made and it completely wraps the card all the way around, so it actually looks pretty good. This card does use two 6-pin connectors, so you will need to make sure that you've got two of them. I'm pretty sure most people are not going to be buying one of these nowadays anyway, but if you were to, you have to make sure that you've got enough power connections to actually get it running. And being the Sapphire Nitro model, it is a slightly overclocked version of the standard thing. Underneath the gorgeous fan shroud, this card boasts 2048 shaders, 4GB of GDDR5 memory, a PCI bus of 256 bits, a clock speed of 1040 MHz, that's slightly over the standard model of 970, and it has a TDP of 190 watts. What actually makes this card even more impressive is its original release price of $229. Nowadays that sounds absolutely phenomenal because you can't get anything really for $229. You're talking more around the AMD Radeon RX 6600, which is considered an entry-level graphics card nowadays, whereas this would have been considered pretty high-end. Now, when it came to testing the R9 380X, I wasn't really sure what games we should actually put against it. Usually for older cards like this, we generally have a different test suite, but I decided to check out a few games first just to see, you know, what kind of thing it can perform like, and those games are generally kind of easy enough to play. The first game that I actually tested was Doom Eternal. Now, in Doom Eternal with a 1080p high preset, we managed to easily achieve 60 FPS and the game played extremely smooth. This really actually did surprise me because I thought the card was going to perform a lot worse than this, which then made me actually try a different game as well. The second game that I tried was Stray, again in a 1080p with a high preset. We managed to get an average of 52 frames per second. There were slight stutters on this game when you were actually loading large open areas, but once they'd actually loaded, the whole gameplay actually smoothed out and it gave you a great gaming experience. And because of those actual results, I decided what we would do instead is actually pit it against our normal test suite of games that were generally high-performing games in 2023. Now that is really going to test a card like this because it clearly was not designed for that. Even its limitation in VRAM nowadays is really going to make it struggle in certain scenarios, but the card really did surprise me. Throwing our standard test suite against this card in a 1080p with a high preset, which is generally what we do for all cards in the studio. In Dead Island 2, we managed to get an average of 43 frames per second with a 1% low of 19. That wasn't great, to be honest. It did cause a lot of stuttering on the screen, but it goes to show that the card could actually get the game up and running, and it played reasonably well. In High on Life, the card actually performed a little bit better, getting an average of 52 frames per second with a 1% low of 24. Hogwarts Legacy is a pretty demanding game, and this game did actually give us a bit of a driver warning when we actually started it up. It kind of warned us that our driver was too old and we needed to upgrade it, but of course driver support on this card ended a long time ago, so you ain't going to get much luck there. But all you had to do is just press next and the game started anyway. In that game we managed to get an average of 28 frames per second with a 1% low of 19. Resident Evil 4 generally plays pretty well on most hardware, even though it does look absolutely stunning and it can be a little bit demanding in places. And with this card we managed to get an average of 29 frames per second with a 1% low of 24. It didn't provide the most smoothest of gameplay, of course, and you probably wouldn't want to play it at that, but if you were really desperate and you were running one of these cards in your systems, you could probably get away with it. In Spider-Man Remastered, we managed to get an average of 44 frames per second, which was fantastic, as well as a 1% low of 25. Now that low 1% low actually caused quite a bit of stuttering when you were on the ground in the game, but when you were actually swinging up high, it wasn't too bad. That game also gave us a driver warning on startup, but the game continued to open anyway, so that still allowed us to actually test the game. The two games that actually wouldn't start on this graphics card, and it's mostly down to that driver issue, was of course Starfield. It just wouldn't start at all. You got a driver warning, but there was no way of actually continuing on. Maybe there is a way to actually patch that, but why would you want to with a graphics card like this? You have to have some set expectations here. And then the second game was The Last of Us Part 1, which pretty much gave us the exact same messages as Starfield, in the fact that you couldn't start the game because of lack of driver support. Now again, those aren't impressive results of course in a 1080p high setting, and that's because the card is reasonably old now. Driver support ended for this a while ago. Even though it will start a lot of modern games, you're going to get performance issues, you're going to get a lot of warnings, but some of those games did actually start, but they didn't provide the best experience. So what I decided to do next was actually give those games a bit more of a test and see how we could tweak the settings to get them more playable. With tweaking settings in Dead Island 2, we managed to get an average of 59 frames per second with a 1% low of 30. That was running in a 1080p with a medium preset and enabling FSR2 with a quality setting. The game played pretty smooth, and even though the 1% lows were around 30, it provided little stuttering in the game, only when it came to new areas. If you had a lot of enemies on the screen, it was still more than playable. You could actually get that game to play all the way through if you were to set your expectations quite low and just enjoy the game as you go along. High on Life actually performed exceptionally well in a 1080p with a medium preset. No need for any help for FSR here to get over an average of 60 frames per second. We managed to get an average of 75 frames per second with a 1% low of 32. Many people would actually class that as completely playable because lots of people still aim for 30 frames per second. So as long as you've got your 1% lows up there, you're going to be pretty fine. This game actually run pretty smooth even with that low 1% lows, and it was more than playable, and it actually looked pretty good at those settings as well. Hogwarts Legacy, even though it was a very demanding game in places, managed to get an average of 73 frames per second with a 1% low of 40. I was actually reasonably impressed with this because it was actually set to 1080p with a medium preset and FSR2 set to a balanced setting. This actually didn't destroy the graphics at all. It still looked a very good game to play. You could understand what was going on, and I think you could actually get away with playing it all the way through. This game actually provided me with the biggest surprise of all because it actually does struggle on some of the more modern hardware, so I think this card actually held up pretty well with that one. In Resident Evil 4 with a 1080p low to medium settings with FSR2 enabled with a balanced setting, we managed to get an average of 46 frames per second with a 1% low of 35. The game with this performance was more than playable with very little stuttering throughout. Although in the dark areas it was really dark, so you couldn't really see a lot. I don't know whether that was a problem with the graphics card or maybe drivers itself, because obviously you are going to struggle in certain things with this kind of card, particularly at this kind of age. So if you are going to play that game, make sure you turn your brightness up so you can actually see when you go into dark spaces. Spider-Man Remastered's performance actually increased greatly when we actually started tweaking some settings, setting it into a 1080p resolution with a medium preset and enabling FSR 2.1 to a balanced setting. It provided a very smooth gameplay experience. We managed to get an average here of 65 frames per second with a 1% low of 40. The game still looked absolutely stunning at medium settings, and it was completely playable, so you're going to get away with it on that. Now, it is a big shame that AMD did stop the driver support on these cards because, as our testing shows, they still have some great raw performance inside them. They're not something that can really compete at top end anymore, but they can actually get games playing and you can have a great experience on them. Let me know in the comments below if you've had an R9 380X or if you're actually still using them. What are you playing? What kind of experiences are you getting? I actually love testing this card so much that I think I'm going to try and get some more roughly about the same age to test, and you won't want to miss that, so make sure you subscribe to the channel. I'm sure as always we'll catch you guys in the next one.